Today we have a focused and detailed explanation of Carl Jung's concepts of the ego and the unconscious, without delving into broader topics like archetypes or individuation. 1. The ego in Jungian psychology. The ego is the central component of conscious awareness in Jung's model of the psyche. It is the part of the mind that gives us our sense of identity, continuity, and individuality. The ego is responsible for organizing thoughts, perceptions, memories, and feelings, allowing us to navigate the external world and maintain a coherent sense of self. Key characteristics of the ego. Conscious awareness. The ego is the seat of consciousness. It is what we refer to when we say I or me. Identity and continuity. The ego provides a sense of personal identity over time, allowing us to recognize ourselves as distinct individuals. Reality orientation. The ego helps us interact with the external world by processing sensory information, making decisions, and adapting to reality. Defense mechanisms. Like Freud, Jung acknowledged that the ego employs defense mechanisms, e.g., repression, denial, to protect itself from overwhelming or conflicting unconscious material. Limitations of the ego. The ego is not the totality of the psyche. It is only a small part of the larger self. It is often in conflict with the unconscious, particularly when unconscious material, e.g., repressed emotions, instincts, or complexes, threatens to disrupt conscious awareness. The ego's over-identification with the conscious mind can lead to a lack of self-awareness and psychological imbalance. 2. The unconscious in Jungian psychology. Jung's concept of the unconscious is far more expansive than Freud's. He divided the unconscious into two main layers: the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. These layers contain material that is not immediately accessible to conscious awareness but profoundly influences our thoughts, behaviors, and experiences. A. Personal unconscious. The personal unconscious is unique to each individual and is shaped by personal experiences, memories, and emotions. It contains material that has been repressed, forgotten, or ignored by the conscious mind. Contents of the personal unconscious. Repressed memories and emotions. Forgotten experiences. Subliminal perceptions. Information perceived but not consciously registered. Complexes. Emotionally charged clusters of ideas, memories, and feelings that influence behavior. For example, a power complex might drive someone to seek control in various situations. Complexes. Complexes are autonomous psychic entities that can take over the ego if they become too powerful. They often arise from unresolved personal conflicts or traumatic experiences. For example, a mother complex might develop from unresolved issues with one's mother, influencing relationships and behavior. B. Collective unconscious. The collective unconscious is a deeper layer of the unconscious that is shared by all humans. It is not shaped by personal experience but is inherited and universal. It contains archetypes, which are universal, primordial patterns of thought, behavior, and imagery. Contents of the collective unconscious. Archetypes. Universal symbols and themes that appear across cultures and time periods, e.g., the hero, the mother, the trickster. Instinctual behaviors and patterns. Mythological and religious imagery. Archetypes and the unconscious. Archetypes are not specific images or ideas but rather templates that shape human experience. They manifest in dreams, myths, art, and cultural symbols. For example, the shadow archetype represents the darker, hidden aspects of the psyche, often repressed or denied by the ego. 3. Relationship between the ego and the unconscious. The ego and the unconscious are in a dynamic and often tension-filled relationship. The ego must navigate and integrate unconscious material to achieve psychological balance and self-awareness. Interaction between the ego and the unconscious. Conflict. The ego often resists unconscious material, particularly when it threatens the individual's sense of identity or stability. For example, repressed emotions or shadow aspects may surface in dreams or irrational behaviors. Integration. A healthy psyche requires the ego to acknowledge and integrate unconscious material. This process involves confronting repressed emotions, complexes, and archetypal influences. Dreams. Dreams are a primary means by which the unconscious communicates with the ego. They often contain symbols and imagery that reflect unconscious processes. Active imagination. Jung developed a technique called active imagination, where individuals engage with their unconscious material through visualization, dialogue, or creative expression. This helps bring unconscious content into conscious awareness. The role of the ego in self-discovery. The ego's task is not to dominate the unconscious but to establish a dialogue with it. By exploring unconscious material, the ego can achieve greater self-awareness and psychological growth. Failure to engage with the unconscious can lead to psychological imbalance, neurosis, or a fragmented sense of self. 4. Differences from Freud's views. While Jung was influenced by Freud, his concepts of the ego and the unconscious differ significantly. Freud's ego. Freud saw the ego as a mediator between the id, instinctual drives, and the superego, moral and societal constraints. The ego's primary role was to balance these forces and maintain psychological stability. Jung's ego. Jung viewed the ego as the center of conscious awareness but emphasized its relationship with the unconscious. He believed the ego's task was not just to manage internal conflicts but to integrate unconscious material for personal growth. Freud's unconscious. Freud focused on the personal unconscious, which he saw as a repository of repressed sexual and aggressive drives. He emphasized the role of childhood experiences in shaping the unconscious. Jung's unconscious. Jung expanded the concept of the unconscious to include the collective unconscious, which contains universal archetypes. He believed the unconscious was not just a source of pathology but also a wellspring of creativity, spirituality, and growth. Conclusion. In Jungian psychology, the ego and the unconscious are central to understanding the human psyche. The ego represents conscious awareness and identity, while the unconscious contains both personal and collective material that influences thoughts, behaviors, and experiences. The dynamic relationship between the ego and the unconscious is key to achieving psychological balance and self-awareness. Jung's insights into these concepts have had a lasting impact on psychology, spirituality, and the study of human behavior. Certainly, Carl Jung's concepts of the ego and the unconscious can be illustrated through characters and themes in English literature. One of the most prominent examples is Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886. This story provides a vivid exploration of the ego's struggle with the unconscious, particularly the shadow archetype. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. A Jungian analysis. 1. The ego. Dr. Henry Jekyll. Dr. Jekyll represents the ego, the conscious, rational, and socially acceptable aspect of the psyche. He is a respected scientist and upstanding member of society, embodying the values and norms of Victorian England. Characteristics of Jekyll's ego. He is rational, controlled, and morally upright. He suppresses his darker desires and instincts to maintain his social reputation. His ego is in conflict with his unconscious desires, which he finds unacceptable. Limitations of Jekyll's ego. Jekyll's over-identification with his socially acceptable persona leads to repression of his darker impulses. His inability to integrate his shadow, Mr. Hyde, results in psychological fragmentation and eventual self-destruction. 2. The unconscious. Mr. Edward Hyde. Mr. Hyde represents the unconscious, specifically the shadow archetype, the darker, repressed aspects of the psyche that the ego refuses to acknowledge. Hyde embodies Jekyll's hidden desires, instincts, and primal urges. Characteristics of Hyde as the shadow. He is impulsive, violent, and amoral, representing everything Jekyll represses. Hyde is described as deformed and monstrous, symbolizing the ugliness of the repressed unconscious. He gains strength as Jekyll's ego weakens, illustrating the power of the unconscious when it is ignored or denied. The shadow's influence. Hyde's emergence reflects Jekyll's inability to confront and integrate his darker side. The more Jekyll suppresses his shadow, the more dominant Hyde becomes, eventually taking over completely. 3. The relationship between the ego and the unconscious. The dynamic between Jekyll and Hyde illustrates the tension between the ego and the unconscious. Jekyll's failure to integrate his shadow leads to his downfall. Conflict and repression. Jekyll's ego represses his darker desires, creating a split in his psyche. Hyde represents the return of the repressed, as the unconscious material Jekyll denies begins to surface. Integration and individuation. Jung believed that psychological health requires the ego to confront and integrate the shadow. Jekyll's inability to do this results in his psychological disintegration and eventual death. Symbolism of the transformation. Jekyll's transformation into Hyde symbolizes the eruption of the unconscious into conscious awareness. The potion Jekyll uses to transform can be seen as a metaphor for his attempts to control the unconscious, which ultimately fail. 4. Broader implications in literature. The story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a powerful exploration of Jungian themes. The dangers of repression. Jekyll's repression of his shadow leads to his downfall, illustrating the dangers of ignoring the unconscious. The novella serves as a cautionary tale about the consequences of failing to integrate the darker aspects of the self. The duality of human nature. The story reflects Jung's belief in the duality of the psyche, the coexistence of light and dark, good and evil, within every individual. It highlights the importance of acknowledging and balancing these opposing forces. The shadow in literature. Hyde is a classic literary representation of the shadow archetype, a recurring theme in literature, e.g., Frankenstein's monster, Dorian Gray's portrait. These characters embody the repressed aspects of the protagonist's psyches, forcing them to confront their darker selves. Conclusion. Robert Louis Stevenson's strange case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde provides a compelling literary example of Jung's concepts of the ego and the unconscious. Dr. Jekyll represents the conscious ego, while Mr. Hyde embodies the repressed shadow of the unconscious. The novella illustrates the dangers of ignoring the unconscious and the importance of integrating its contents for psychological balance and self-awareness. This timeless story continues to resonate as a profound exploration of the human psyche and its complexities.